Welcome to this class, and today I'm very excited to present to you on cognitive control and consciousness in open biological systems. And one reason I'm so excited about that is that I actually just published a paper. It's now available as a preprint on the Biosystems website. As a disclaimer, I'm not a neuroscientist. However, I have worked on and off on problems related to neuroengineering and neuroscience in preparation of this particular class on control in biological systems. I thought I should also pay a little bit more attention to what we know about the brain and how it works, particularly from the perspective of control theory and also thermodynamics. So by diving into this problem, I noticed that consciousness is really what is called a hard problem. And it is a hard problem alongside with some other issues where people banging their heads against for years and years and years and seem not to make a lot of progress. And I have just put some other hard problems up here where people are pretty much basically in the dark about what's going on and try to find models and try to do simulations. And I start here on the lower left side. Dark matter is a big issue in physics and astrophysics. It seems to play a big role. How the universe evolves, and because it's dark matter, we can't see it. But I found this image from a dark matter day that was in 2024 organized by CERN. And I really like the what's here in small print. Everybody loves a mystery, right? Because that shows we are really motivated to figure things out and we don't know. And that's one, I think, of the hard problems to be solved. Another hard problem is aging. So I put that up. So this is relatively easy to visualize because you can compare, can show young person and old person, you see the differences. However, when it comes to the underlying mechanisms, then it's very difficult. And there's many theories. Like there's hundreds of theories about why we age. Somebody said jokingly there are maybe as many aging theories as aging researchers, right? Because everybody sees a little aspect of that and then makes a theory around that. So there's definitely the need for some consolidation. Now, when it comes to consciousness, which is a hard problem, I was running again into the same issue that I didn't find a good image to show here. What is consciousness? Is that the process? Is that the state? And the only thing that I found, so I went to artists and see what they were thinking about consciousness, and I found this artistic rendering. It's called an energy circle. Maybe that fits somewhere into this, but we have no idea or no visualization in a way of consciousness, right? It's a hard problem. What I also show here is Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, who said we don't know certain things, but we want to, right? We want to understand how things work. And sometimes it just takes, we have little problems. I mean, you are educated to solve problems. And sometimes the little problems you can solve them easily, but then there are problems that take some time and take days and weeks to work on. But these are problems which are really hard, meaning that many people are working on this for a very long time. And what you get into when you start attacking hard problems is that it is at some point it becomes annoying to you. So you're always in a balance between being annoyed by the problem, that it's there, that you don't have an answer, but you also are typically very curious. You have to be very motivated to go on. You don't know when the problem is being solved or when you make a contribution, but I think we are, when we look at these type of problems, we are in that situation. Yes, it's annoying, but we would like to know. Or make some progress in the interpretation. Okay, so I start in my paper with some definitions when it comes to consciousness. And I think there's one reason why this field is sometimes so confusing when you read papers is because there are no clear definitions for certain keywords. So I'm differentiating between awareness and consciousness, and that stems from a paper from Eric and Roman who made that differentiation, which also can be backed up by functional imaging and other measurements. And so awareness is defined here as a subjectively experienced stimulus perception of becoming aware of something from outside or inside the body. Right? And consciousness I define here as intentional thought and control of actions in the context of personal memory. So to give you an example, what I mean by that is that let's compare an animal like a dog with a human. The dog is aware, right, about its surrounding or when it happens to itself. However, a dog is not conscious in that definition, doesn't have conscious thought, right? So that's a differentiation that I'm doing. You often find the term consciousness for awareness in many papers, right? But in order to move this forward, I thought you have to make that definition. The other type of definition I would like to provide here is that of semantic information. And the semantic information was based on definitions provided by Koczynski, Wolpert, and Rovelli, who are working on open systems, thermodynamically open systems. And this type of semantic information is different to syntactic information, which we use when we talk about a transmission channel. The theory of Shannon is based on what we call syntactic information. So what is semantic information? That is information which is meaningful for the organism to stay viable. Okay, so it has a meaning to the organism. It helps the organism to decide to do certain things, and therefore it's meaningful. And you can define that meaningful information in a quantitative way in a thermodynamics way. So that is what these authors have contributed to the field, and I'm using semantic information in this context. Last time we spoke about dissipative systems, and I basically added the brain to this roster of examples of dissipative systems. Just to repeat again, what are dissipative open systems? Well, dissipation means that some of the energy that is being taken in is being used for work, but another part of that energy is not being used for work, but it is being converted into heat, and that heat is being dissipated. So there's a very nice German term for that. It's called Entwertung. And Entwertung means that Wertung means value, and Entwertung means devaluing. So you are devaluing the energy that you have available, and part of that is being not used, it's being dissipated. This is an ongoing process. As part of that, what we find then is that structures form spontaneously. Like, and these are all examples for that, and it happens on any scale possible. The brain belongs, for me, to that, because we spoke last time mainly about organisms being open systems, but the brain itself is also an open system, because it needs to take up energy matter to work. So in particular, the brain has only 2% of body mass, but 20% of the metabolism of your body, right? So there's a lot of dissipation going on in the brain. And what that means is we should be on the lookout for self-organization, for synchronization, for excitation patterns, rhythms, all of these kind of things, what we typically expect from open systems, we should also find in the brain. this is the thermodynamic view. Let's come back to control theory. And this is the first image in my paper. And initially I had it in there, then I took it out, and then in the last revision, before I submitted, I put it back. And I'll tell you why. So what I'm showing here is, from control theory, so you have a plant, which is an organism that needs to be controlled. You have a controller, which is the brain. And you may notice I show that as a dotted line because it's an open system, right? So what does it do? What's the purpose of the controller? It has to keep that organism in a particular relationship to the environment because, as I said before, we need energy and matter in order to be viable. It has to have sensors, and there's actually two types of sensors. One is external sensors. So these are our 5 senses, right? We take up exteroceptive information. And from the internal sensors, we take care and receive interoceptive information. What is interoceptive information? Well, to give you some examples, it could be pain, it could be hunger, it could be well-being, things like that. So for this, we also have sensors, and what the controller does, it combines these to make decisions. And we want to be in a well-being state. That's the goal, and that basically closes the loop. If we are position ourselves in an unfortunate way, somewhere in the environment where we cannot eat, we cannot drink, we are not feeling well, so that's kind of the goal of that controller to keep us in that. So again, I have a very fundamental thermodynamic view of this thing. What you see is there's something else on this, and that's the actuator. And we spoke about that last time in class. So actuator, it's muscles, right, that basically execute what the controller wants to do. However, when you look into the engineering literature, you find that actuators also have problems. And the problems, could be not being nonlinear, showing saturations, having faults. So what can happen is that the controller tells actuators to do certain things, but they're not executing. The actuators not doing what they're supposed to do, or they have limitations. For that purpose, you have feedback, which is called in the literature is an actuator loop that loops back directly from the actuator back into the controller. So the controller can take these deficiency of the actuator into account when sending out signals to the actuator to do certain things. This is kind of the third information inflow, right? So we have interoceptive information, exteroceptive information, and now what I'm suggesting here, that there's a third type of inflow that comes from actuators. Okay, so we'll get to this a little bit later. This thing has to work for us in all kinds of environments. So think about millions of years back. No, that's too much. 100,000 years back, when the first kind of humans kind of navigating the environment, and they were kind of migrating. And so, of course, you have to pay attention. There may be predators, right? And you have to recognize those and be careful. And that is the type of semantic information that you want to have. Because if you ignore that predator, it may cost your life, right? So it's very important to have that information. Now, again, the things in your environment happen completely randomly, completely probabilistic. You don't know what happens in the next minute. And this weekend, I was with some of you at New York University for a conference, and I took a snapshot. Being in a town, it's very busy. Things happen and change all the time. You have to be very alert to do the right things and not get under a bus, for instance. Again, we have all these changes, and we have to be alert to deal with these changes all the time. If you say, okay, can we model this in some way? can we model the responses of organisms, sometimes also called agents, in these type of environments? How would that work? Can we do that? To see how things perform, given that you have certain capacities to deal with that information. And that brings us to Markov decision processes, which is one type of control problems that you can simulate. And you may have been exposed to that in other classes, like in biostatistics class. What is the goal here? The goal for the organism is to establish kind of a meaningful correlation with the environment to stay out of equilibrium. Again, that's the definition. And for that, it needs to gather and utilize semantic information. Okay. Now, what you can do is you can develop a model and then mathematize that via Markov decision processes. And then you can simulate the models with different features for decision making. As a supplement of my paper, I do that, and I will get to that in a minute and show actually how that works. Now, in order to get there, we have to take our control diagram and then put certain things into it that we need for Markov decision processes to simulate. So what we have here is basically very similar. So we have an external state that's called y of t, which is basically the state of the environment. And it would, you can classify that, you can measure certain things that you can put here. With the environment, you are in a correlation, which is important for your internal state, which is called here x of t. And now you get two types of information streams from yourself, from the x of t, which is the interoceptive information, then the exteroceptive information. When this information comes down to you, it is being corrupted. So, if we apply information theory, we have low pass, we have band pass, we have noise, we have all kinds of things happening. So we can define that. And so instead of observing the environment as it is, we only have this y dash of t, which is basically what we observe, what is kind of left. Now, it's very important to say that what we sense, for what we are aware, is a fairly good representation of our environment, right? So there's a lot of issues with the data basically coming down from the senses into our brains. We still have what we get, what we can work with, is a fairly good representation. It's not that this is a complete illusion and we don't know what to do with that, right? So when we do things based on that, and I think it's pretty good. So the information, again, goes into the controller, into the brain, and then we do some actions. What is the goal? Well, to stay out of equilibrium. And I want to come back to this loss of information, which is really impressive. The bandwidth that I show here, this cartoon, is taken from this book from Thor Nordstrander's Danish author. And his book is The User Illusion, Cutting Consciousness Down to Size. So this is a key figure where you have, on the left-hand side, you see all the information coming in. So it's 10 to the 10th bits average. It's taken up by the senses. It's kind of being filtered down. And then it comes into consciousness. I haven't defined that yet in detail, but I want to mention that because it's here. And you see what he states, 16 bits per second. That's not a lot. Okay. And then it goes back to this actuator world where you do certain things and where you may have again, a higher information exchange between these components. The other thing that is a little bit curious here that you say, well, there's more than 5 inflows, right? So I have seen papers that claim that you not only are sensitive to 5 inputs, but to up to 30. And one particular I want to highlight here, one of the senses that you normally don't talk about is the sense for heat. That doesn't fit to any of those categories, but you can feel heat even before you touch an object. So that's another sense that we have. Anyway, let's go back to Markov decision processes. And this is an example that is in the appendix of my paper, where I want to simulate the migration of organisms, it's called agents, within a defined area. The organisms enter in the middle of the left side, and the goal is to get to this destination on the upper right-hand side. And so this is the area. In the initial setup, the organisms can either go forward or upward or downward. They have an initial energy budget of 100, which they deplete when they're kind of moving through this environment. With every step, they're using 10 points. What I also added is a trap in the middle here on the top, which could be a predator. So when they get into that area, they will not survive. I also provide 4 food sources in this. When you see the dashed line, this is an organism which goes straight forward. It's very unlikely that happens, but if an organism goes straight in the middle and then at the end it goes up, it would take that path just for running. It can happen. Then it would survive because the energy budget that it has before doing the last step is 30. Okay? But many other organisms might go through and get out of steam, so to speak. They don't have enough energy. Unless they heat, and that's the other one, and the dotted line is an organism that takes a route, first goes down, goes back, hits by chance a food source, and takes that food source. So it replenishes what was being spent. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. So it's at 60 with the energy budget. And now replenishes, but only to a maximum. So there's a saturation effect. So it goes only to 100. It depletes the food source, but it doesn't utilize all that food because it can't go over 100. And then it goes on, it goes all the way up, comes down again, but then runs out of steam. Now what I can do is a couple of thousand iterations, and then you have these numbers, so 26% for this setup. So this is a blind organism space. Now I want to give this organism certain capacities. So initially, in the first refinement, I give the organism ability to see something. So for instance, if an organism gets into this area where there's a trap, I reduce the likelihood for it to escape to 50%. Before, it was the end for the organism. Okay? So this is called partially observable Markov decision processes, POMs for short. If you add that, the success rate increases from 26 to 30%. This is a very specific setup. You see where this could be used, and you can refine it and make it more realistic. The next thing is very crucial. I add an ability for organisms to communicate and learn. And so they have to have something that allows them to communicate. So what that means is, for instance, a group getting into a new area, as it's shown on the lower right-hand side, they want to know, well, where is a food source on my way? Are there fish on this river? Are there some predators so that I can avoid getting trapped? And they may send out a scout. The scout comes back and says, well, I went this way, I was successful. So the group can learn from the experience of what others have experienced. They could, other people living in this area, that you could communicate to and ask questions. Where is the next tree which has fruits? Where is a pond where I can get fish? To get that information. How does it affect the simulation? What I do is I increase the likelihood for making decisions to encounter the food source. So it's more often that an organism actually finds and interacts with the food source. what is being learned is, as a group is only taking into account those who were successful reaching the destination. Those who did not, they cannot communicate that information back. So this is called group agent reinforced learning. And I found another paper from Google. They're working on software so that we can better navigate and communicate with the internet to find certain answers. And they call it active question answer, AQA. And I think this is exactly what's happening here. As a last step, I now add something. The organism have the ability to plan ahead. And what is the consequence of that for this simulation? Well, what they can do is when they encounter a food source, rather than taking that up and wasting a lot of things, they now store the food source. So I have the dotted line path that I have here is the same like as we had before, where I showed that that organism would not get to the destination. But now when it gets to the food source, it's not consuming it, but it's taking it along. It's playing ahead. It knows it has still a far way to go, but rather than depleting it and only taking some of that, it now takes that food source along and replenish and uses that food source when the energy levels are on a relatively low level. Then it uses it more effectively. So, and actually, what is that for the percentages? The ability to learn and communicate increases 37 in this setup. And then organisms which have the ability to plan ahead increase that success rate to 61%. So these are very specific cognitive abilities that organisms have, and they're all related to the brain. And it has, particularly when it comes to communication and planning, obviously has something to do with consciousness, right? This is an ability that puts this in motion. Now, let's get to theories of consciousness. That's very confusing. And I was as much as confused when reading about aging, because there's so many aspects of theories. You now have review papers that try to classify and summarize the different theories that people have about consciousness, right? So I cite a few in my paper. But there's some which are a little bit more popular than others. And one which is relatively popular is what is called the global workspace theory, which was proposed by Bars in 1988. And I found also a descriptive cartoon here in a paper from the Hain from 1998. And so what are the properties here? We have specialized modules. And then the output of one module is selected somehow and broadcasted to other modules that kind of collaborate. And then there's kind of also some connections between these modules and the workspace. And what this theory does not well explain and has been questioned about is a definition of consciousness. Where does consciousness come in? So it's a kind of description of very high level, but the mechanisms are kind of far from clear. And it's sometimes called basically the theater of consciousness, where you're sitting around the stage and there's a spotlight which shows a particular part of the stage. That is where consciousness is. But behind the scenes, like in the dark, you have a director who's doing the execution of the performance. You have stagehands, scriptwriters, scene designers, and so on, but you can't see them down in the dark. What that means is there's also a lot of unconscious processes playing a role. But I think that this is a very kind of popular way to explain consciousness. But again, what are the mechanisms behind that? It is so popular because it kind of correlates with functional brain imaging. And I have this here. This is an example. This is, I think, one of the first PET scans were, conducted on humans in performing certain tasks, like hearing words, seeing words, speaking words, and generating words. For each of these tasks, you see different functional patterns, and of course we have I've gotten way better over the many years. We now have functional MRI, both signals, and many other things. So we get more details about these activity states. But in a way, what we see here is a global workspace, and different parts of the brain are being active and communicate. This is exactly, what we're seeing here. So there is good correlation between that global workspace theory and what we're seeing in these images. So now I want to talk about this model that was developed by Baddeley in 90. So it's actually Baddeley and Hitch did the first publication in 1974 on working memory and the phonological. So this came 15 years before the global workspace theory. They came up with a model that I really like because it's more mechanistic, it's more functional. So first of all, you see this graph here, and in the center of that, you have a short-term memory. That's kind of the working memory that you have when you do certain tasks. That memory is fleeting. It cannot keep the information for long. For instance, if you ask somebody for the telephone number, and he starts or she starts talking, and you typically remember maybe 5 numbers, right? And then you have to start writing things down. So the time and the amount that our working memory can remember is very short, and it's only, depending on the publication you look at, some people say just maybe 2 or 3 seconds, right? And then that information is gone, right? In this concept, what's being shown here, you get auditory input, you hear something, and you do some kind of analysis of the words being spoken. Of course, that has to come from some other place, like a long-term memory, where you learn what certain words mean, okay? But you work with that as you listen, like you're listening to me. It's all being analyzed in that short-term working memory, okay? Now, if you want to formulate a question, then you have to prepare sentences that are being forwarded into this, what is called the phonological output buffer. That's a different part of the brain. And then from there, they go out. They'll be articulated through all the muscles that you have in order to say something, right? Now, the problem is that sometimes it takes longer to formulate a sentence, right? And I told you there's only a few seconds and this information is gone. So what has to happen is you have to refresh your working memory. And here we have the feedback here that goes from this area back into the short-term memory. So this is a refresh of your fleeting working memory. This information is coming back, okay? So for instance, all the spoken words that you have not yet delivered, in order to not forget them, they're coming back to you into the short-term memory. This is crucial. Things that you formulate to communicate come back to you, right? It's like an inner voice, okay? And I think this is key to, at least one of the keys, to understand the mechanisms behind consciousness. And I stumbled about this paper. Now, the working memory from Baddeley was never discussed as being consistent or has something to do with consciousness. But this guy, Buxbaum, in this paper, actually hints to that. He says, isn't that something that is related to consciousness? So I highlight here the key, that for me was a key sentence, where he says that our present goal is to show that even a seemingly consciousness averse information processing model, such as the phonological loop, owes something to an interoceptive analysis of conscious experience. And then he talks about the inner voice, the inner speech, and so things like that. And in a way, this kind of feedback that we have, that comes through the phonological loop, is that third type of information inflow. into the controller. And it comes from yourself. In this figure, I'm now putting this into this kind of control framework. So you will recognize a couple of things that we had before. You have the information that goes to the actuator all out to others, to the group. What is the flow of information related to this communication, to language? And there are some very good studies being done, and they all say that if you communicate through language, the information content, that's based on Shannon. That's not whether information is meaningful or not for you, is 40 bits per second. There's a slight difference from language to language. On average, that is what it is. And so when engineers define transmission channels, they're going with that information, 40 bits per second. Okay? So that information, if something comes back, it's being taken up, you hear it, you listen to that, and it's a lot of information, but this information is being kind of filtered, and then basically repeating what was in that working memory model from Berkeley. You also have a working memory, and that working memory is actually in the anterior sensory cortex. You can locate that where that is, right? So why? Now, if somebody talks, we are aware of that. This is the area where we are aware of what's going on in our surrounding. Okay? As you formulate sentences or thoughts, they are now going out into a different part of the brain, the posterior motor cortex. And that is where we find this second memory. I call this an articulation buffer. And from there, it goes out into articulatory pathways that at the end, so you articulate your muscles. So this is basically articulator module in that control diagram, right? And now I have again that dashed line that's coming back, which is kind of the phonological loop that comes from that motor cortex, which is completely unconscious, into this aware area. So this information flows back. Now, in one version of this diagram, I put in also a number here like 40 bits per second. So at the end of the day, you have to provide a data stream which is 40 bits per second. That's the language, right? But I don't know exactly how much in this kind of ping pong between these two brain areas, how much bandwidth there is. At the end again, what's going on is 40 bits per second, but there could be a little bit more as different parts of the brain kind of communicate with each other. And, so I did leave that number out because I don't know for sure. The phonological loop, for me, and the ability to speak goes together very strongly with consciousness. And we can, of course, spell out the words like I'm doing, or I can keep my mouth shut and think about that, right? Silently, subvocal, right? And these are the inner thoughts that I'm having, right? Now, by using words or numbers or letters, we're using symbolic information. It stands for something, it has a meaning for us, right? And if you then ask, when did this develop? It's very hard to say. But obviously, in this image here from a cave in Spain, I found these drawings, which basically, these are icons. They represent something. So you see that in the development of mankind, people starting using that symbolic information, like put it out there as drawings. Now, this particular one dates back 64,000 years. In that area, you didn't have the modern humans coming out of Africa. You have Neanderthals. But it is maybe the first step into using symbolic information and maybe also hand signs and things like that. They are kind of part of the same kind of group of functions. This figure is also in the paper, and what I'm trying to do here is make a suggestion. I make the suggestion to combine that phonological loop that I've explained to you with what we're seeing in imaging or the global workspace theory, right? So what I'm suggesting here on the left side is this is the brain areas that are being activated if you receive information, sensory information, right? And you activate that kind of sensory cortex, you're becoming aware of that information. We see things, we hear things, we interpret things. Then as you formulate speech, you activate a different but overlapping set. So you still have the sensory cortex active with the working memory. Information goes down to the motor cortex, which also has an articulation buffer. And then you have again the dashed line coming back to the sensory cortex. And that is where you become aware of your own thoughts in a way, right? This is kind of the inner voice that you hear. And it's updating the fleeting working memory so that you can think about certain things for a longer time, have a proper communication, things like that. Now, is there evidence for that already when we look to neurological image data, functional data? Yes, there is. Okay, so people have dived in, realizing maybe that they're looking to conscious processes. And so, in this particular work, I like from Schomer's, Garanani, and Pulvermüller. The paper is entitled Neurocompetition Consequences of Evolutionary Connectivity Changes in the Civilian Language Cortex, where they use a lot of structural data from spectrography and other things in order to develop a model that show very nicely how many more connections we have in the human brain between these brain areas that are contributing to language as compared to primates. So there is definitely an anatomical difference between these species, and they do some very nice modeling to show that information or excitations reverberate longer in humans between these areas than they do in primates, both in terms of the amplitude but also the duration, which is again a very important key feature of us. Okay. One aspect that we haven't much touched yet is that kind of self-organization. And in order that two brain areas communicate, you have to have synchronization. Otherwise, they cannot communicate. And that's being shown on the next graph. Of course, everybody knows of brainwaves, right? So that means that a bunch of neurons are working together and exchanging information, and brain waves are a typical example of self-organization. Right? Now, a lot of more detailed studies also have shown that sometimes we have standing waves. So for the phonological loop to work, portions of the sensory and motor cortex kind of have to synchronize. And that synchronization between brain areas is also some kind of self-organization. And I want to make an experiment. These are two independent systems for now, have about the same frequency. But over time, since they are connected, they will actually start synchronizing. And I noticed that by the slight movement this construct has. The movement has become stronger. Now they're completely synchronized. The consequences of all of that, of the synchronization, the phonological loop, are enormous. I want to show that with this. So you want to go food shopping. Consider ancestors like 50,000 years ago. They had already had these skills, ask questions to others to navigate the environment. What do you do today to go food shopping? Well, let's say you are in a new area, migrate in a new area, okay? Well, you start opening your laptop and you Google opening hours and where you find your store, and you go into a car. Somebody trained you, you drive the car, you have a driver license. Use the navigation system again, right? You have to know how to operate it. And it leads you to the shop. Then you go into the shop. You start reading what is on the product description. Maybe you call somebody and say, is this a good price? Then you fill your cart and you go to the checkout. You talk with the clerk using a credit card. And then finally you go home. You see what the difference is? Right? There's so much complexity, level on level on level, using symbolic information. Right? So that is the consequence. And behind that is way more the development of computers. If you use a cell phone, maybe information goes to satellite, like for your navigation system. There's so much other things that we humans created by having these abilities. So to summarize, I have hypothesized that consciousness developed alongside communication as a third type of information inflow. And the global workspace theory, which is so prominent, provides a concept which is consistent with these neuronal correlates and functional imaging. But the working memory and the phonological loop provide kind of underlying functional mechanisms. So I think that, again, I'm not an expert in this field, but I think those models should be considered to be combined. And I also have shown you that we find indeed examples for the brain to be an open dissipative system. So we see self-organizing mechanism. Thank you very much for your attention.